I just finished the book, The Wager, and I wanted to share with you kind of an interesting and disturbing passage. Storms continued to batter the ships day and night. John Byron stared in awe at the waves that broke over the Wager, bandying the 123-foot vessel about as if it were no more than a pitiful rowboat. Water seeped through virtually every seam of the hull, flooding the lower decks and causing the officers and crewmen to abandon their hammocks and berths. There was no longer any realm under the weather. The men's fingers would burn from gripping the wet ropes and wet yards and the wet shrouds and the wet steering wheel and the wet ladders and the wet sails. Byron, drenched by the pouring rains as well as the waves, was unable to keep a dry thread on his body. Everything seemed to drip, to shrivel, to decompose. During that March of 1741, as the squadron plowed through the howling darkness toward the elusive Cape Horn, where were they exactly on the map? Byron endeavored to maintain his station to watch. He spread his feet like a bow-legged gaucho and held on to anything secure. Otherwise, he'd be hurled into the frothing sea. Lightning blitzed the sky, flashing before him and then turning the world even blacker. The temperature kept dropping until the rains hardened into sleet and snow. Cables became encrusted with ice, and some of the men succumbed to frostbite. Below 40 degrees latitude, there is no law. Below 50 degrees, there is no God. And Byron and the rest of the crew were now in the furious 50s. The wind in these parts, he noted, blows with such violence that nothing can withstand it, and the sea runs so high that it works and tears a ship to pieces. It was, he concluded, the most disagreeable sailing in the world. On March 7th, he noticed that many of his companions could no longer rise from their hammocks. Their skin began to turn blue, and then as black as charcoal, a fungus of flesh. Their ankles swelled hideously, and whatever was consuming them progressed up their bodies into their thighs and their hips and their shoulders like some corrosive poison. When Schoolmaster Thomas suffered from the affliction, he recalled he initially felt a small pain in his left big toe, but soon noticed hard nodes and ulcerous sores spreading across his body. This was accompanied, he wrote, with such excessive pains in the joints and knees, ankles, and toes, as I thought before I experienced them, that human nature could never have supported. Byron later caught the dreadful disorder and found that it engendered the most violent pain imaginable. As the scourge invaded the sailors' faces, some of them began to resemble the monsters of their imaginations. Their bloodshot eyes bulged, their teeth fell out, as did their hair. Their breath reeked of what one Byron's companion called an unwholesome stench, as if death had already come upon them. The cartilage that glued together their bodies seemed to be loosening. In certain cases, even old injuries reemerged. A man who had been injured in battle, which took place in Ireland more than 50 years earlier, had his ancient wounds suddenly break out anew. Still more astonishing, one of this man's bones that had healed after fracturing at the battle now dissolved again, as if it had never been consolidated. Then there were the effects on the senses. One moment the men might be overcome with visions of streams and pastures, then realizing where they were, they would sink into complete despair. Reverend Walter noted that this strange dejection of the spirits was marked by shiverings, tremblings, and the most dreadful terrors. One medical expert compared it to the falling down of the whole soul. Byron saw some of the men descend into lunacy, or as one of his companions wrote, the disease got into their brains and they ran, raving mad. They were suffering from what a British captain had dubbed the plague of the sea, scurvy. One night, during the endless storm, as Byron struggled to sleep in his soaked, rattling berth, he heard the 8 bells and strove to get on deck for another watch. As he staggered through the labyrinth of the ship, it was difficult to see. Lamps had been extinguished for fear they might topple and catch fire. Even the cook was not permitted to light his stove, forcing the men to eat their meat raw. When Byron emerged on the quarterdeck, feeling the cold blast of the wind, he was startled to find only a few dozen people on watch. The greatest part of the men, Byron wrote in his account, had been disabled through fatigue and sickness. The ships were in danger of running out of hands to operate them. The surgeon, coated in a smock, he took out his saw and cut open several corpses, trying to pinpoint the cause of the disease. Perhaps the dead would save the living. According to the reports of his findings, the victims' bones, after the flesh was scraped off, appeared quite black, and their blood seemed to have a peculiar color, like that of a black and yellow liquor. After several dissections, Eddink proclaimed that the disease was induced by the frigid climate. Yet, when it was pointed out to Eddink that scurvy was just as prevalent in tropical climates, he conceded that the cause may remain an entire secret. The outbreak raged on, a storm within a storm. The doctor did everything in his power to help. While Anson's expedition was trapped at sea, the main medicine prescribed was Dr. Joshua Wart's Pill and Drop, a purgative that was advertised as performing many marvelous and sudden cures. Anson, who refused to let his men undergo what he would not endure himself, took the pills first. Thomas wrote that most of the men who consumed them were seized very violently by both vomit and stool. One sailor, after a single pill, began to pour blood from his nostrils and lay near the point of death. Ward turned out to be a quack. His potion contained poisonous amounts of the metalloid antimony and some suspected arsenic. The pills purged the sick of needed nutrients. They likely contributed to many deaths. The surgeon would later die of illness of the voyage, conceded despairingly that all his available treatments were useless. Now, discussing sexual practices like masturbation was taboo in 1742, so there wouldn't be many written records about it, and these are just educated guesses based on the limitations of ship life. Sailors on crowded ships in 1742 likely resorted to discreet methods of masturbation due to lack of privacy. They would find solitude in lookout shifts, rigging checks, or late-night tasks on deck that might have provided brief moments of isolation. Some men have snuck into occupied storage areas, though this could lead to getting caught and punished, sometimes by death. Mental stimulation was likely the common method, especially during long stretches at sea. Using common items like blankets or loose clothing could have offered some degree of concealment of the evidence. Years later, Byron has come home. Byron reached Great Marlborough Street in a fashionable area of central London. He went to an address where a few of his closest friends had lived. The place was boarded up. Having been absent so many years, and in all that time never having heard a word from home, I knew not who was dead or who was living or where to go next, Byron wrote. He stopped at a dry goods shop that his family used to frequent and inquired about his siblings. He was informed that his sister Isabella had gotten married to a lord and was living nearby in Soho Square. Byron walked there as quickly as he could and knocked on the door of his sister's house. But the porter looked at the alien figure. Byron prevailed upon the man to let him inside where Isabella was standing. A thin, elegant woman who later wrote a book on etiquette. She looked bewilderingly at her visitor, then realized it was none other than her dead brother. With what surprise and joy my sister received me, he wrote. The 16-year-old boy she had last seen was now a hardened seaman.